My name is Nicholas Houston, and I'm the Director of Visa Australia, Australian migration lawyer and migration agent. And I'd like to welcome you to today's presentation, which is about state nomination by and large and the issues associated with applying for state nomination. Okay, so essentially just a little bit by way of background. I've been working in the area of migration for about nearly 18 years now. Started off working for the Department of Home Affairs as a lawyer, and then after 3 years, and where I built a sort of reasonable understanding of the way the migration system works, I left Australia and established Visa Australia in Mexico City. And that was in 2004 or thereabouts, so quite a while ago now. And in that time, we have worked with sort of thousands and thousands of mostly skilled migrants, mostly professionals, but some also trade occupations and so forth, to apply for skilled visas and migrate to Australia. In terms of the way that we started out, most of our clients were not in Australia, were overseas, and the migration program at that point allowed people to migrate to Australia directly. You didn't need to come to study, or you didn't need to be in Australia to apply. And in fact, when I started, if you were in Australia specifically, you couldn't apply. And the Australian government didn't want people coming in on student visas and then transitioning to a skilled visa. Well, the world's very different now in terms of the way that the migration program is working. And in fact, there's been a significant number of changes in the time that I've been doing this job. For example, state nomination didn't exist when I started off. And for example, accountants could migrate with a score of 5 out of 9 on each part of the IELTS. So there's been an ever-evolving set of legal and policy criteria that people need to meet to be able to migrate. Okay, so Visa Australia is our head office is in Canberra, and we still work with a lot of people from Latin America, a lot of Spanish speakers, but we also have a lot of clients that are in Australia from different backgrounds. The pool of people that are here on other visas and that are looking to transition to permanent residence one way or the other, by and large through the skilled visa program. In terms of the options, there's basically 3 ways that you can migrate to Australia. So the first is the skilled visa program, and that allows people who have qualifications and work experience that's in demand in Australia to migrate. You can either apply directly from overseas if the policy framework permits that, and at the moment the border's closed, and well, until yesterday, there was no offshore migration. The South Australian government has just opened its program to offshore applicants, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. But the other way of applying for the skilled visa was to study in Australia for 2 years, or alternatively for 12 months, and then transition through. So that's the first way of migrating, the skilled visa program. It's the heart of the Australian migration program and has been since the 1980s. The other way is through employer sponsorship. So employers can sponsor people for temporary work visas, but also permanent work visas. If you're sponsored by for a temporary work visa, then in many cases you can transition to a permanent visa after 3 years. So there's another set of legal requirements for employer-nominated visas, but the main thing is you have to have a company that's prepared to offer you a job and sponsor you for the visa. Okay, so we won't talk about that today because of those practicalities. And then the third way is partner visas. So of course, what happens is that in many cases that students are in Australia for 3 or 4 years, of course, they meet someone, they fall in love, and they get married, and it all ends up in a partner visa. So again, there's a set of legal requirements, but the basic thing is that you have someone who loves you and who wants to sponsor you for a partner visa. So finally, there are asylum visas, the humanitarian visas, but really the criteria are quite strict, and it's not something that you'd really want to contemplate because to be eligible means that terrible things have happened in your life, and that is not somewhere where you want to go if you can avoid it. Okay, so we're back to the skilled visa program, and the requirements are the same whether you apply from outside Australia or from within Australia. Those requirements are age. You have to be under 45 years old. Secondly, English. So you have to have a level of English that allows you to work in Australia, essentially. And because you're all here in the seminar and it's in English, you would all have more or less the right level to apply. If you English is what they call proficient, which is a score of 7 out of 9 on the IELTS test, the famous IELTS test. You get additional points in the visa points test, and if it's superior, you get even more points. But if it's competent, which is the working level, you need to apply 6 out of 9, then you don't get points for your English in the visa points test. So there's an ongoing struggle that everyone has to engage in to improve your levels of English according to one of these international tests. Okay, the third legal requirement is you are accredited in an occupation that's in demand in Australia. So there's two things in that requirement. The first is accreditation, and the second is the demand for your particular occupation. In terms of those two requirements, I'll speak first about the demand. So effectively, there's different lists of occupations. The federal government has a list. It's the medium and long-term occupations list. There's about 180 occupations on that list in demand all over Australia. And you've got the classic occupations are on that list: engineers, accountants, actuaries, construction project managers, architects, many medical and health-related occupations, but also many trades occupations like plumbers and carpenters and motor mechanics and cooks or chefs. So the list is quite broad, 180 occupations. But in addition to the federal government's list, then each state government in Australia also has a list of occupations in the particular state. And there's another 400 occupations on those state government lists. And what that means is that more people or more occupations can apply for a skilled visa with the support or the nomination of a state government. Okay, so state government nomination is a critical part in the visa process for many people, and in fact, for most people. State government nomination, it gives you extra points on the visa points test, so that can be helpful. But the main thing it does is triggers an automatic invitation to apply for a skilled visa. So at the moment, the way the migration system is working is you can't just apply for a visa like you could in the old days. You have to be invited to apply for a visa. And the way that that works, it's a system called Skill Select. And every 3 months at the moment, then there's a round of invitations. So if you have an occupation on the federal government's list, and if you have a very high points test score, we're talking about 95 points in most cases. It can be lower depending on the occupation. So if you're a medical doctor or a nurse with critical skills, you can get invited at a lower points test total. But in most cases, the Australian government is not inviting people for the independent subclass 189 visa. What that means is that everyone else is looking for a state nomination to trigger the magic of an invitation to apply for the visa. Okay, and this is the jumping off point to today's event, discussing state nomination and the intricacies of that. But before we do that, I'll just, to be complete, go back to that third legal requirement. It was accreditation in an occupation that's in demand. So we've discussed the demand, and accreditation is effectively, it's the first step in the visa program process, and it allows the Australian government to consider whether your qualifications and work experience is more or less comparable to someone doing your job in Australia. Okay, so in most cases, it is the professional association or college for your occupation that does that assessing process. The issue is that different occupations have different accrediting bodies, and different accrediting bodies have different rules. So you have to work out what occupation is relevant to you with your qualifications and work experience, and then prepare that accreditation application. And that then, once you're accredited, it has a life of 3 years in most cases, and it's the basic platform upon which the rest of the visa process is built. Okay, so we recommend, if you're wanting to apply for a skilled visa, that you get that accreditation work done, and that you work out those accreditation issues and have your positive accreditation, so that you are ready to apply for state nomination the minute the state nomination opportunity becomes available. Okay, so we could have another event on accreditation issues, but that's a question for another day. And if you want more information about that, please contact our office, and we can do an assessment and look at what accreditation would lead to what visa strategy for you in particular. Okay, so then the fourth legal requirement, fourth and final legal requirement, is the points test, the visa points test. So as a basic requirement, you need 65 points to apply. Recent changes mean that it's not that difficult to get 65 points to apply, particularly when they started giving extra points to people who were either single or who were married with someone who had reasonable English. So now that is not so much an issue, and we can all relax on the basic threshold for the points test for the state nominated visa, knowing that we would need 95 points for the independent non-state nominated visa, but for the state nominated visa, the points test is all good, mostly. Okay, so that's the basic requirements, and I now want to get on to a discussion of state nomination. I will say that at the end of the sort of formal presentation or introduction, I will take questions, because I know everyone has a particular situation, and the point of today was to try and answer some questions that you might have. So we will get to that point. Okay, a 46-year-old market researcher, got to be under 45. Anyway, so state nomination. So the issue is that different states have different policies about who they will nominate, and different requirements. And it is really quite diverse, the different things that the states are looking for. The issue is, well, what effectively happened is that the state governments were accepting applications and nominating people, but as the number of places being awarded to skilled independent visa applicants dropped, the state government processes came under enormous pressure and enormous demand for people seeking state nomination. And what happened is that the state governments, in our view, lost the plot. And I want to be quite critical of the way the state governments have managed their state nomination programs. And that is for a fairly objective set of criticisms that we as lawyers have, in that the state governments frequently change their nomination requirements. So you have to meet the requirements at the time that you apply. But of course, you'd be looking to what the requirements are, and many people are in fact adjusting their circumstances to be able to meet those requirements. And if there's no stability in what those requirements are, it becomes very difficult to plan a migration process. The other issue that we have found with state governments is that there's a high level of discretion in how they interpret the criteria. And in fact, discretion that are built into the criteria. For example, in Tasmania, you have to prepare a career statement that links you with your qualifications and plans to a particular industry and a career in Tasmania. It's not very clear what should go into that career plan, and it just means that it enables the state governments to pick and choose who they would want to nominate. which is not very satisfactory from the point of view of you, the applicant, not quite knowing whether you'll be accredited or nominated or not, or us as the lawyer trying to advise people. Okay, unpredictable decision making. Over the years, we've sent, for example, sent two pretty identical applications for graphic designers to the Northern Territory. One was accepted, and our former client is now an Australian citizen, and the one made a week later was refused, and that person is still in Mexico. And it was just that a quota had been reached, but there was no information about what that quota was. So it was unpredictable. There's no review rights, so even if you apply, you think you meet the criteria, and there's a peculiar refusal decision, you can't seek a review. Okay, so that means that two things. It's it's not that secure to apply if you can get a bad decision and can't fight it. But the other thing is that it's not that fair either. And the final issue is that programs open and close suddenly, and we have faced this situation a number of times in the different jurisdictions. In the Queensland migration program, for example, is closed, and it's been closed for quite a while. Often what would happen before the end of the financial year, quotas would be exhausted and programs would close overnight without any notification. It happened in the ACT in 2018, where all of a sudden they had exhausted their quota and they closed the ACT nomination program. In fact, at that point, Visa Australia decided to agitate, and we ran a campaign working with international students that had come into Canberra to prepare themselves to apply for ACT nomination. And we organised a protest outside of the Legislative Assembly here in Canberra. About 200 people came to that protest. We drew quite a lot of media attention, including back in India, because many of the people protesting were from India. And in addition, we then briefed a barrister to prepare a class action against the ACT government. So a class action is to collectivise the number of people that are affected by that decision, and to go to court and to seek damages and seek some compensation for the actions of the government in that sudden closure of the program. Okay, so what happened then is that the ACT government reopened the program, but it redid the policy. And now the ACT government has one of the best programs in Australia, and it's the best program because it provides the most transparency and the most certainty in terms of outcomes. So we didn't in fact have to sue the ACT government. It got the message, it received the message, and reformed its state program. And in fact, all of those people who had then been cut out as a result of that threatened class action and the protest, all of them had the fighting chance to get their visas, and most of them would now be permanent residents. Okay, so a little bit comes back to, well, the role of a lawyer in trying to assist clients to achieve these migration outcomes in a system that doesn't provide a lot of certainty at the moment. Okay, but none of this is your fault. Let me say, I know that there's a lot of people in Australia never had advice and have done haphazard courses in terms of migration outcomes, and you now need to think about where you need to move or what you need to study next to give yourself the best chance of applying. I just think that's the reality, and it's not your fault you didn't know at the time. What we're trying to do with people who are not yet in Australia is provide strategic advice in terms of looking at any accreditation and what accreditation you can apply for, then what course you would need to study in Australia to be able to apply for state nomination, and what would be the best state to apply for. So of course, we've done an assessment of the state government nomination programs and are sending or recommending that our clients come and study in states that have reliable programs. Okay, so we're into the ranking. Okay, so basically, in our view, the ACT government in Canberra has the best state migration program. The reason for that is that it's transparent. You can see the criteria that the ACT government is requiring, and you can assess whether you meet those criteria. And then you can also change your circumstances and can kind of rely on that being stable in terms of making a later application. In the ACT, there's a list of critical occupations. So if you have an occupation on that critical occupations list, it's really worthwhile considering either moving to Canberra, and if you're accredited and you move to Canberra and start working in your occupation, you can apply for a skilled visa nomination after 3 months, okay, and potentially for a permanent visa after 6 months of working here in Canberra. So it's fairly safe and it's fairly certain. If you're from offshore, the same thing. Come into Canberra, study, and potentially you can apply for a visa after 3 months. Okay. The second best state in our experience is South Australia. And historically, the South Australians were the first state to start pushing to have a state nomination program. And we have found that the criteria are quite clear in South Australia. So it is possible to assess whether you meet those criteria. And we have found their processing to be reasonable as well, in that the clients that we have assisted have pretty well all of them been nominated if they meet the criteria. The South Australian government is quite responsive in answering questions, and there's not a lot of discretion in the criteria. There is some discretion, mind you, but it's not as bad as it is in Tasmania, for example. So in South Australia, the issues are that there's different rules for different occupations. So you have to go and have a look at your occupation to see what the rules are, different language requirements, and also in many cases, if you're in Australia, you need to be working in your occupation in South Australia. And that is something you have to be careful of, because if you don't find a job in South Australia, it may mean that you, well, it may mean that you won't be nominated, and it puts you under pressure to find a job. Okay, in your occupation in Canberra, you can still apply if you're working in any occupation, not your nominated occupation. And we all know that it can be difficult to find a job if you're a graduate in particular in your area. But it's just one thing to take into account when looking at these state government nomination programs. The third best program in our view is Tasmania. And we say in Tasmania, the criteria are the most generous criteria out of all of the state governments. And it's basically, you can be working in any occupation on a graduate visa in Tasmania and apply for state nomination. And if you had studied in Tasmania for 12 months as well, you could then apply for state nomination. So those policies are still in place. And so on the surface, it seems like a great destination, because find a job, any job, 6 months and you're in. If you've got a work visa, full-time work visa, or study for 12 months and you're in. The issue is, and this is where we're a little bit worried about Tasmania, in that they may have encouraged too many people to move to Tasmania, and they don't have enough nomination places. It's a little bit what happened in Canberra before we threatened to sue the ACT government, and they fixed it. But in Tasmania, what has happened now is there's quite a lot of discretion in how they process applications. So you've got to prepare a career study, and there's certain occupations and industries that are more favoured than others, and you've got to have a job, but it's not clear kind of, or it helps to have a job, but it's not clear exactly what that means. So we are still recommending people go to Tasmania, but particularly if the ACT is not open because you don't have an occupation on the critical skills list, or the criteria are too difficult to meet in South Australia. So the states that we're recommending people move to are those 3 states: Canberra, South Australia, and Tasmania. Okay, New South Wales. New South Wales is problematic because they have a very large list of occupations that they will nominate, and But the issue is you have to express an interest in applying for nomination to New South Wales. And the situation is exactly the same as expressing interest for this permanent subclass 189 visa. You need a really high points test score to be invited. So what that means is that the criteria published on the website are not really accurate, because they're not the real criteria. The real criteria should be, if you have 90 points, then read on. If you don't have 90 points, then forget it. To its credit, the New South Wales government has a warning on its website, and it says, if there's any other options in any other state, take that. Don't rely on the New South Wales government. And I just think that needs to be taken to heart by people considering applying for state nomination in New South Wales. There's no information about who is being nominated and who isn't. We follow some Facebook sites for migration agents and other Facebook sites. It's very haphazard. The people who are being invited and who aren't being invited. And it's very difficult to understand what is really happening in New South Wales. Okay. The Northern Territory. I think the requirement is that you either work or study in the Northern Territory for 2 years. So it is a reasonable policy if you want to move up to Darwin, look for a job and or study. There is some uncertainty about how they process applications, but we would say the Northern Territory is the 4th best state. Western Australia has a fairly clear set of policy guidelines. They have different occupations for people who have studied in Western Australia from people who are applying, who are working there, and you just need to read the criteria carefully. We found that it is quite difficult to get an application approved in Western Australia. Well, actually, that was prior to COVID. But if you are there, and if you have an occupation on one of those lists, it's worthwhile to pursue that pathway. And that then leaves Queensland, which is closed. So, I mean, at some point, the Queenslanders may get round to opening their migration program, just as well as they might get round to opening their border to the rest of the country. But in the meantime, there's no point at looking at Queensland until there's something to look at. Okay, so that is just, I wanted to give some overview of those state nomination programs, because it's important that you have a realistic view of how they work, and are careful with the selections that you make in terms of either moving to Canberra or moving interstate, and some of the things that you need to take into account. I just want to, before we go to the questions, I want to look at some critical future predictions, which is to take a step back further from the issue, the technical issues of applying for the visa, to government policy considerations. So there's two things, or there's a couple of things that are happening, but when the COVID occurred and the government closed the border, what happened was that it closed the border to offshore migration, and it meant that the pool of people able to apply for the skilled visas became those people who were already in Australia on student visas, graduate visas, temporary employer-sponsored visas, working holiday visas, a whole range of different temporary visas that people held, and those people then were able to apply for state nomination and receive their visas. So the program has been working, but it's been drawing from a pretty narrow and narrowing pool of candidates. Okay, so the question is, I think this is what's happening, is that pool of people, now the Australian government wants to open it up, and it wants to open the program again to people who are outside Australia. Okay, so the first indication of this is the South Australian program. So on Tuesday, it opened to offshore applicants, and there's a list of 70 occupations that it will nominate, including marketing specialists, public relations officers, construction project managers, environmental consultants. A whole range of general occupations are now on the South Australian government's list, and it indicates that they can't find people from within Australia, basically. and they want these people coming in from offshore. You have to have 8 years experience. So again, it's only people that have been working for that period of time, and you need very good English. Okay, so not everyone will be able to apply for South Australian nomination, but it is encouraging in the sense that it suggests that there is a skill shortage in Australia, and the state governments, but perhaps also the federal government, will throw open the borders at some point next year. Okay, so we're encouraged by that. And I think at the time that the government made its last announcement in the budget, it also said it was looking to move to a big Australia in 2022. So I think it just understood that with COVID, migration couldn't continue, and the government accepted that we would have no more international students for that period of time and no more migrants. But the indication is that as soon as we resolve the issue of the vaccination rate and the issue of quarantine, it'll be a great time to be an intending migrant, and there will be a lot of opportunities, both at state government level, but also perhaps for the independent subclass 189 visa through Skill Select. So our advice is hang on, because we're on the edge of this reopening of the Australian visa program. The second issue to be aware of is the balance in the migration program. So there's a tension between having people come in as permanent residents versus having people come in on temporary visas and then transitioning from Australia to permanent residents. And I think employers and other sectors in the economy like to have a large number of people floating around who don't have permanent residence. There's various reasons for that, often to do with people without permanent visas make loyal workers, because if you lose your visa, you go home. And it comes down to the balance between whether the Australian government will support a permanent visa program and open that to people coming in from offshore, or whether the expectation will be that people will need to come in on other visas and then transition after living in Australia for a period of time to permanent residence and citizenship. Okay, so that is basically the overview that I wanted to give, and just explain some of the factors that will affect your ability to apply. And I'll now look at some questions that have come through. So the first one is from a 44-year-old market researcher living in Mexico. Okay, so the issue is at 44. I don't think you're going to have time to get accredited and apply for nomination before you turn 45. 45 is the cutoff point. If your partner is eligible, then she could be the primary applicant and apply. But if that's not the case, yeah, the visa program won't work for you. Okay, another question from Narendra. And it's a question about Victorian state nomination, and you work for a private health insurance client. Well, it depends what your accreditation was, and then whether you would meet the Victorian criteria. The problem in Victoria as well, it's gone to an invitation-based system of applying for nomination, and that means that there's no certainty and no transparency. So, there's no advice that we can give, and you're really at the mercy of the policy of the Victorian government as to what it will do or not do for a person in your situation. If you've got 95 points, that's very positive, and it may, if the program opens up as well, trigger an invitation for a subclass 189 visa. But at the moment, you're just hanging on and hanging in there, waiting for that application to invitation to be issued. Okay, so then we've got Anne, who's applied for probably lodged an expression of interest in Victoria as well. And again, it's the same thing that applies to you, working for a health insurance company as a computer professional. Again, black box, it's a black box, but we'd suggest that you stay there, because with that number of points, you'd think that as soon as the program opens up a bit, you'll be invited one way or the other. Okay, so what happens if you're not invited? Well, what's happening is that people then run out of graduate visa, enroll in a course, go back to a student visa, can keep working part-time on that student visa, hanging in there while waiting for the migration program to get going. If that student visa is refused, people are seeking a review of the decision at the Administrative Appeals Review Tribunal, which is the appellant body for applications made in Australia if you get a decision you don't like. And what the AAT does is then reassess your application with a fresh set of eyes. If you met the criteria, they instruct the department to grant the visa. If not, they refuse it. Okay, the thing is, it's taking 2 years to get a hearing in AAT, and that means that it buys time. It buys time and an additional up to 2 years to resolve these state nomination issues. That's the way the system's working in real life, and that's what we recommended some of our clients do. So it depends where you are in that system, but just to say that there's ways of hanging on and with work rights while you're waiting for these state nomination opportunities to reopen. Sydney, forget it. Sydney is death. Sydney, Brisbane and Melbourne, essentially, they're not regions. The policy is to encourage students and 485 visa holders to move to regional Australia. And there's very little prospect of pulling a nomination out if you're in one of those cities. Of course, this might change tomorrow. Might already have changed, in the time that I started the presentation, there might be an announcement. It's the way things work. But we are encouraging or advising our clients to consider moving to one of the other states with more favourable nomination policies. Okay, I'm 23 and work in India as a WFM analyst. Okay, if it's not on the skilled list, forget it. You'd need to either to study in something that is on the skilled occupations list, potentially work in that occupation, get accredited in that occupation, and look at applying from outside Australia or coming into Australia to do those studies. So if you're not eligible for a visa now and you're outside Australia, you can come in and study something that is linked to an occupation that will then allow you to apply for the visa based on the Australian studies. Okay, not all courses open the door to permanent residence. Some courses are more expensive than others of those that do. So it's a question of getting advice on a strategy that will give you the best chance of then applying to migrate. Okay, 30-year-old female working in Queensland for 5 years as a physio, studied at University of Queensland. Well, I mean, honestly, that is a really good situation to be in, and it's just now waiting for the Queensland government to reopen its program. You would think that physios would be a high demand for that occupation, and you've got a lot of points. So I just think it's a question of waiting, and if you run out of visa, then you'll need to either go back and study something else or and just wait. You could consider moving as well. Physios, I believe, are on the list in the ACT. If you could get a job down here as a physio and you can start applying for jobs from Queensland, then after 3 months, you'll be applying for a visa under the state nomination program in Canberra. So that is something that you will need to consider, and we can talk to you about that later. Okay, family sponsorship. So family sponsorship, if you've got a family member in regional Australia and an occupation on the federal government's list, then that family member can sponsor you for a visa, and you get an extra 15 points on the visa points test. The issue is it doesn't trigger an automatic invitation. So you're really kind of just still stuck at that point, even though you've got a family member who's prepared to sponsor you. And again, it's working like the subclass 189 visa, that you need quite a high points test to be invited with a family sponsor for that visa. We have seen it happen, and it can happen, but yeah, you're looking at either 90 or 95 points. Currently on a TSS, which is the employer sponsored visa. Well, I mean, Depends on your occupation and where you're living, and whether the company is prepared to nominate you for a permanent visa, and whether it can. So, so you need advice on that, or need to give more information. Okay, so 28-year-old postgraduate currently on a graduate visa, mechanical engineering degree, but not working in the field here in Canberra. Mechanical engineering is currently not on the ACT list. What's your advice? Yeah, so Canberra's not much good for you, and you know, from what we have heard, there's not much likelihood that mechanical engineers will come back onto the list. I'd be looking at moving interstate and looking at other state nomination programs. It's a tough one, but in fact, remaining in Canberra is not likely to help your cause. Okay, if someone meets the requirements of 2 states, yes, okay, so that is the issue. You can put in 2 expressions of interest, separate, and then therefore wait invitation in for either of those states. So you don't just have to say that you want to go to Northern Territory and that's the only place you want to go to, because you can put in a second expression of interest and then hope that you're invited in each of those states. Okay, I have a family who lives in Sydney. Can they sponsor me? Nope. The answer is they can't, because that's family sponsorship is linked to regional Australia, and it's another little incentive that they give to people to live in regional Australia, because then in some cases you can sponsor a family member. Okay, so a little bit, that's the policy behind, that is the policy behind that policy. Okay, so can we apply for a subclass 186 visa from outside Australia? So 186 is the employer's nominated visa, and sure, yes, you can. Okay. Okay, well, look, unless there's any other questions, I'll wrap it up with some, yeah, concluding remarks. So basically, I think the Australian visa program, it's been quite tough, the skilled migration program over the last year, and I mean, it's sort of a direct consequence of COVID. There's been a lot of uncertainty, and the closing of the border has meant that people couldn't come in. But I think that pressures are again building in the labour market, and also by employers to get the migration program going again. I mean, the government wants to get the international students back in, and also the state governments want to open their programs. I know that here in Canberra, the recommendation is to the ACT government is to reopen their program. It hasn't happened yet, but it's with the cabinet, and so we're waiting for a decision on that. And I think it'll start happening over the next, up until Christmas. South Australia has reopened to offshore. That's very encouraging. We know the ACT government wants to open to offshore, and it's going to create opportunities for people. So our advice is, don't give up. You can remain hopeful. With good advice, you can make decisions that mean something. If you're already in Australia, you may need to be flexible and relocate, but you'd want to have accurate information about where best to relocate to. If you're here, there's ways of remaining in Australia for longer through the appeal process to the AAT, and then on to the federal court. In some cases, you can be in Australia for up to 8 years and never have a visa granted because of seeking these reviews and so forth. I mean, that's the reality of it. It's obviously better if you can get the visa quicker rather than later. But there are, there is advice out there, and if you seek advice and form a visa strategy, then there's every chance you'll end up with a visa. Okay, so that's it for today. Thank you everyone for attending. I mean, I hope it was interesting and helpful. And I mean, I know there's a lot of speaking, but that's just the way of the world, really. Good to practice your English, the listening component. If you'd like to speak to us further about it, then please feel free to organise a consultation. You can book that through our website at a time that's convenient to you and to us here in Canberra. And we look forward to giving advice that allows you to, you know, get this visa application job done successfully. Okay, so my name's Nick Houston. I'm the Director of Visa Australia. Good afternoon. Bye.